Welcome back to another DPS analytic video. This is going to be the third week of Naxxramas for Season of Discovery. Looking at all percentiles first, we'll finally be looking at the mythic difficulty this week. Now that we have a couple thousand logs across the board for most of the popular classes, we can use this as a more accurate metric going forward. With that being said, looking at this percentile, we can see that the Warlock is no longer in first place by a pretty large margin. Everything is kind of starting to catch up to that, which is what we expected to see. Looking at max percentile, we will see that the Fire Mage still on top. Mage is scaling exceptionally well due to how Ignite is affected by the Seal of the Dawn. Maybe this gets changed in the future and mages will lose that first place spot, but as we continue to get higher ranks of that Seal of the Dawn, I don't see that this is going to change. Just last week, for example, the Melee Hunter and Feral Druid were very close to the Fire Mage in first place. Moving on to the 95th percentile, the Destro Locks have went down a couple of spots, from pretty much dominating to where they're at now in the 4th place spot. This is due to the Shadow Flame build that was going around that was pretty much bugged. It was pumping out some pretty janky numbers, so this has been fixed as of this current week. But other than that, everything else is pretty close. Only real outliers is from the Shadow Priest and below, which I expect some of these classes to move up in the rankings next week. Fury Warrior being one of them, Ellie Shaman, Shadow Priest, and of course the Frost Mage. And then finally going through each boss fight specifically and picking out the top performers. Starting off with Patchwork, we have the Fire Mage by around 2,000 to 3,000 DPS. And then we have the Rep Pally and then the Fury Warrior. Next up we have Grobulus, Balanced Druid, and Fire Mage, not too far behind, but the Balanced Druid is taking it for this week. Next up we have Gluth, which the Fire Mage does so far ahead. This is just unbeatable at the moment by around 8,000 DPS. Just some crazy RNG, some crazy crits. Likely not going to see this getting beat for a couple of weeks. Next up we have Thaddeus. Once again, the Fire Mage, damage modifier fights. Ignite just goes crazy. And always kind of trailing that is the Rep Pally this phase, as well as most of the Hunter specs, putting up pretty consistent DPS across the board. Moving on to Noth. Same thing like I just said. Hunter specs and Rep Pally not too far behind, but again, Fire Mage just seems to be untouchable right now. Moving on to Hygen. Balanced Druid and Feral Druid taking the top place spot and not the Fire Mage for once, so that's cool to see. We like to see that. Moving on to Lotheb. Marksman Hunter this time. Was expecting to see the Fire Mage, but the Marksman Hunter kind of proving that wrong. And then again, Rival Hunter not too far behind that as well. Next up we have a Nubricon. Fire Mage very far ahead. Melee Hunter and then the Balanced Druid. And then the Ellie Shaman putting up some pretty big numbers on this fight as well. Next up we have Firelina. Fire Mage really far ahead on this fight by around 7,000 to 8,000 DPS. Again, some just crazy RNG that's likely not going to get beaten within a week or two from now. We'll have to just wait and see. Moving on to Mayexna. Again, the Fire Mage just seems to be unbeatable on almost all of these fights. The only thing that seems to be trailing behind is the Rep Pally, both of the Warlock specs, and some of the Hunter specs. Moving on to Instructor Resuvius. Fire Mage not too far ahead this fight, but I mean, it is just super ridiculous to see them at the top on every single one of these fights. Again, Rep Pally, Hunter specs, both Balance and Feral Druid competing for those top 5 spots on almost every other encounter. Moving on to 4 Horsemen, we have both Warlock specs taking a pretty huge lead on this fight. Considering all 3 of these specs have really good multi-dotting capabilities, I wasn't too surprised to see them at the top. Now I will say I'm very surprised to see the Assassination Rogue doing this well. Moving on to Sapphiron, we have Affliction Lock once again, but around 1,000 to 2,000 DPS. Destro Lock, Survival Hunter, Balanced Druid, and then the Fire Mage once again. And then lastly we have Kel'Thuzad, Balanced Druid, and the Melee Hunter pretty much tied for that first place spot, but the Balanced Druid is taking the win for this week. Following that again, both Warlock specs very competitive this phase, as well as most of the Hunter specs. And that's pretty much it for this week. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos just like this one. Comment down below what you'd like to see next. And as always, I will see you in the next video.